Welcome to African Folktales by Tammy. Please don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe for more interesting stories. Also share this story to someone who might be interested. Let's get into the story. Mary Parker and John Miller were the embodiment of young love at Riverside University. She was a determined psychology major with big dreams of making a difference, and he was a charming business student with a knack for winning hearts. They met during an interdepartmental event in their sophomore year. It wasn't long before their chemistry grew into a romance that captured the attention of everyone around them. John's charisma and optimism were infectious, and Mary found herself drawn to his easy laughter and grand ideas for the future. "We'll build an empire together, you and me," he would often say, brushing a strand of hair from her face. Mary, ever the realist, would smile and roll her eyes, but deep down she believed in him. Their love felt like it could conquer anything, and for a while it did. They spent their days attending lectures, sneaking off to their favorite cafe for cheap coffee, and talking about what life would look like after graduation. Life felt perfect until one fateful evening when Mary realized something was wrong. It started with small signs: nausea that wouldn't go away, a missed period, and unshakable fatigue. Mary dismissed it at first, convincing herself it was just stress from balancing her studies and a part-time tutoring job. But as the days turned into weeks, doubt crept in. One night, armed with a pregnancy test she had reluctantly purchased, Mary locked herself in the tiny bathroom of her dormitory. She stared at the results, her hands trembling as two pink lines confirmed her fears. Her heart sank. This wasn't part of the plan. When she broke the news to John the following evening, they sat on a park bench beneath the glowing streetlights. Mary clutched the edges of her coat, her voice barely above a whisper. "John, I'm pregnant." John froze, the words hanging in the crisp night air. For a moment he said nothing, his expression unreadable. Then, to her surprise, he reached for her hands. "We'll get through this, Mary, I promise." His reassurance brought her a fleeting sense of relief, but it wasn't enough to quell her fear. She knew what this would mean for their studies, their future, and their carefully laid plans. John suggested they move in together to face this challenge as a team. Mary hesitated but eventually agreed, believing in his commitment. They rented a tiny apartment just off campus, pooling their meager resources to make ends meet. Mary took on extra shifts at the library to save money for the baby, while John promised to pick up freelance gigs. For a while, it seemed like they could make it work. But cracks began to show as the reality of their situation sank in. Mary's belly grew, and so did their expenses. John, once so full of ideas and confidence, began to withdraw, skipping classes and spending late nights out with friends. The final blow came when Mary discovered she was pregnant again. This time John didn't offer reassurance. Instead, he looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite place: fear, guilt, and something that felt like regret. One morning she woke up to find him gone. On the kitchen table was a hastily scribbled note: "I can't do this." "I'm sorry." Mary stared at the note for what felt like hours, her world crumbling around her. She was alone now, with no one to lean on and two lives depending on her. Tears streaming down her face, she whispered to herself, "I'll figure this out. I have to." And so began Mary's journey, not one of love, but one of survival. The sun rose over Willow Creek, casting golden rays on the small apartment Mary Parker now called home. It was a far cry from the lively, dream-filled campus days she had shared with John Miller. Those memories felt like they belonged to someone else, someone carefree and hopeful. Now Mary's world revolved around survival and providing for her two children. David, her firstborn, was a curious and observant child. Even at a young age, he seemed to understand the weight Mary carried. "Mama, don't worry, I'll be an engineer one day, and I'll buy you a big house," he'd say, his small face lighting up with determination. Mary would smile and hug him tightly, finding strength in his innocent promises. Her daughter Emily was just a baby then, barely a year old, when Mary moved into Lakeview Estates, a modest neighborhood on the edge of town. The apartment was small, with peeling paint and creaky floorboards, but it was a start. Mary quickly learned to make do with what she had, stretching every penny and juggling multiple jobs to keep her little family afloat. By day she worked as a cleaner at the prestigious Maplewood Hotel, scrubbing floors and polishing chandeliers for wealthy guests who barely acknowledged her presence. By night she sewed clothes and repaired torn garments for her neighbors, earning just enough to cover rent and school supplies for David. Her days were long and grueling, but Mary refused to complain. She couldn't afford to. Her children depended on her, and she had made a silent vow to give them a better life, no matter what it took. David excelled in school, his sharp mind and quiet determination making him a favorite among his teachers. Emily, on the other hand, was a whirlwind of energy, constantly scribbling stories in her little notebook and dreaming of becoming a writer. Mary was proud of them both, but the weight of being their sole provider often left her feeling like she couldn't breathe. There were nights when Mary would sit alone in the dimly lit kitchen, the hum of the refrigerator the only sound in the room. She'd stare at the stack of unpaid bills on the counter, her hands trembling as she calculated how far her next paycheck would stretch. More often than not, the numbers didn't add up, but giving up was never an option. Mary leaned on the kindness of her neighbor, Mrs. Bennet, an elderly widow who often watched the kids while Mary worked late. "You're a strong one, Mary," Mrs. Bennet would say, her wrinkled hands patting Mary's shoulder. "Those children will grow up and make you proud. You'll see." Mary clung to those words like a lifeline, even on the hardest days. She found small moments of joy in her children's laughter, in the hugs they gave her after a long day, and in the knowledge that she was doing everything she could to give them a future. Years passed, and Mary's sacrifices began to bear fruit. David was now in his final year of university, studying engineering just as he had promised as a little boy. Emily, a bright and confident teenager, was preparing to apply for college with dreams of becoming a journalist. Mary watched them with pride, but also with a lingering ache. She had built a life for them out of nothing, yet she couldn't shake the ghost of her past, the man who had abandoned them when they needed him most. For years she had wondered if John Miller ever thought about the family he left behind. Did he feel remorse? Did he even remember them? Mary told herself it didn't matter. She had done this on her own and she didn't need him, or so she thought, because one day as she was scrubbing the marble floors of the Maplewood Hotel, she heard a voice that made her freeze in place. "Mary," she looked up, her heart pounding. Standing before her, dressed in an expensive suit, was John Miller. Time seemed to stand still as their eyes met. Mary's hands tightened around the cleaning rag, her mind racing. The man who had walked out on her and her children 2 decades ago was now standing in front of her, looking just as shocked as she felt. "Is it really you?" John asked, his voice barely a whisper. Mary straightened, her face a mask of calm. "Yes, John, it's me." In that moment, everything she had buried, the pain, the anger, the questions, came rushing back. She had built a life without him, but his sudden reappearance threatened to unravel everything. And deep down, Mary knew this was only the beginning. Mary stared at John, her face expressionless despite the storm of emotions brewing within her. Memories she had worked so hard to bury threatened to resurface. The man who had abandoned her and their children was standing before her, as if summoned by fate. "Mary, John began, but the words caught in his throat. He seemed older now, his face lined with years of experience, but his familiar charm hadn't faded. "What are you doing here?" Mary's voice was calm, measured, but her fingers gripped the cleaning rag tightly, betraying her inner turmoil. I'm staying at the hotel for a conference," John stammered. "I didn't expect to see you." "Well, life is full of surprises," Mary replied curtly. She turned her attention back to the floor, scrubbing with renewed vigor, hoping he would take the hint and leave, but John lingered. "Mary, I need to talk to you," he said, stepping closer. She froze, then stood up slowly. "Talk? Now you want to talk?" Her voice was steady, but there was a sharp edge to it. "Where was this desire to talk 20 years ago when you walked out on me and your children?" John flinched, his gaze dropping to the polished floor. "I know I've made mistakes." "Mistakes?" Mary interrupted, her voice rising slightly. "You didn't just make a mistake, John. You abandoned your family. You left me to raise 2 children alone while you disappeared to live your life." "I was scared," John admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. I wasn't ready to be a father, I thought. I thought I was doing the right thing by leaving. Mary let out a bitter laugh. The right thing? Do you have any idea what we went through because of your cowardice? Do you even know your children's names, John? John's face turned pale and he shook his head. No, but I want to. I want to make things right. Mary stared at him, her emotions swirling between anger and disbelief. You think you can just walk back into our lives after 20 years and make things right? That's not how this works, John. I'm not asking for forgiveness overnight, he said quickly. But please, give me a chance to explain myself. To meet my kids. They're not your kids, Mary snapped. They're my kids. I raised them, I sacrificed for them, and I protected them. You don't get to claim them now just because it's convenient for you. John looked stricken, but Mary didn't care. She had spent too many years rebuilding her life to let him come in and disrupt it. Stay away from us, John, she said firmly. You made your choice a long time ago, and we don't need you. Without waiting for a response, Mary picked up her cleaning supplies and walked away, leaving John standing alone in the grand lobby. That night, Mary sat at her small kitchen table, her hands trembling as she recounted the encounter in her mind. Her son David walked in, noticing her troubled expression. Mom, are you okay? He asked, his voice filled with concern. Mary forced a smile. I'm fine, David. Just tired, but she wasn't fine. The sight of John had shaken her more than she cared to admit. What was he doing back in her life after all these years? And why now, unbeknownst to Mary, John wasn't about to give up so easily. The next morning, as she arrived at work, she found him waiting for her outside the hotel. Mary, please, he said, stepping forward. I'm not here to disrupt your life. I just want to meet them, David and Emily, Mary said coldly, finishing the sentence for him. Emily, John repeated, as if savoring the name. Please, let me get to know them. I owe them that much. Mary looked at him, her mind torn between anger and an unexpected pang of pity. Against her better judgment, she said, I'll think about it. But deep down, she knew this decision could change everything for better or worse. The days that followed were a whirlwind of tension and ease for Mary. She couldn't shake the sight of John standing in the lobby, pleading to be a part of their lives. Against her better judgment, she had promised to think about it, but the idea of letting him back in filled her with dread. One evening, after much deliberation, she decided to tell David and Emily the truth. They deserved to know. Sitting them down in the small, cozy living room, she took a deep breath, her heart pounding. There's something I need to tell you, Mary began, her voice steady but tinged with apprehension. David, now 22 and ever the protector of his mother, leaned forward. What is it, Mom? You're scaring me. Emily, only 16, sat cross-legged on the couch, her curious eyes fixed on Mary. Your father, John, he's back, Mary said finally, her words hanging heavily in the air. The room fell silent. David's jaw tightened, his expression darkening. Emily, on the other hand, looked surprised but intrigued. What do you mean he's back? David asked, his tone sharp. Mary hesitated. He came to the hotel. He says he wants to make things right. To meet you both. David shot to his feet. After 20 years, he wants to meet us now? The nerve of that man. David, calm down, Mary urged, but he was already pacing the room, his anger bubbling over. I don't need to meet him, David snapped. I've gone my whole life without him, and I'm doing just fine. He doesn't get to walk in now and pretend to care. Emily, meanwhile, sat quietly, her brows furrowed in thought. Finally, she spoke. I think I'd like to meet him. Both Mary and David turned to her in shock. What? David said, his voice incredulous. Why would you want to meet him? Because I've never known him, Emily said softly. I've always wondered what he was like. Don't you? No, David said firmly. I don't care who he is. All I know is that he abandoned Mom when she needed him most, and that's all I need to know. Mary watched the exchange with a heavy heart, her children's opposing reactions tearing her apart. She understood David's anger after all. He remembered the pain of John's absence vividly. But she also understood Emily's curiosity. She had grown up with a void, always wondering about the man who was supposed to be her father. I haven't decided yet, Mary said finally, her voice quiet but firm. This is a big decision, and I need time to think about what's best for all of us. David scoffed. There's nothing to think about, Mom. He doesn't deserve a second chance. He stormed off to his room, leaving Mary and Emily sitting in tense silence. That weekend, John showed up unannounced at their home. Mary was furious. "What are you doing here?" she hissed, stepping outside to confront him. "I needed to see you," John said. "To see them? They don't want to see you," Mary snapped. "And you showing up here uninvited isn't helping." As they argued, the door opened and Emily stepped out. "Is this him?" she asked, her voice steady but curious. John turned, his face softening. Emily nodded, studying him intently. "You look different from what I imagined." "Emily, go back inside," Mary said, her tone sharp. But Emily ignored her. "I want to talk to him, Mom." Mary sighed, torn between protecting her daughter and honoring her wishes. Reluctantly, she stepped aside, letting Emily and John talk on the porch. Later that evening, David returned home to find Emily sitting at the kitchen table, her expression pensive. "You talked to him, didn't you?" David accused. "Yes," Emily admitted, "and he seemed..." "Sorry," Emily said. "I think he really wants to be part of our lives." David scoffed. "Of course he does. It's easy to want that now, after Mom did all the hard work." Emily's voice rose. "Maybe he's trying to make up for it. Don't you think he deserves a chance to explain himself?" David glared at her. "No, I don't. And if you think letting him back in will fix anything, you're wrong." Their argument escalated, leaving Mary feeling helpless. She realized that John's reappearance had done more than stir up old wounds. It had created a rift between her children. That night, as she lay in bed, Mary stared at the ceiling, her mind racing. Letting John back into their lives had seemed like the right thing to consider. But now, she wasn't so sure. For the first time in years, Mary found herself questioning whether she could truly protect her family from the storm that John's return had unleashed. The tension in the Parker household simmered in the days following John's unannounced visit. David refused to speak about him, retreating into his room whenever the subject arose, while Emily seemed to grow more curious, asking Mary questions about her past with John that she wasn't ready to answer. One evening, unable to bear the silence, Emily approached Mary as she prepared dinner. "Mom, why won't you talk about him?" she asked softly. Mary paused, her hands trembling as she chopped vegetables. "Because it hurts, Emily. Your father didn't just leave me, he left you and David too. I don't want to see you get hurt the way I did." Emily's voice was steady but filled with curiosity. "But don't you think people can change? Don't you think he deserves a chance to explain himself?" Mary sighed, setting down the knife. "It's not just about him explaining himself, Emily. It's about whether we're ready to let him into our lives after all this time." "I'm not sure we are." That night, after everyone had gone to bed, Mary found herself unable to sleep. Memories of John flooded her mind, his laughter, his promises, and the heartbreak of finding his note the morning he left. She wandered into the attic, searching for the box of old photos she had tucked away years ago. As she rummaged through the dusty box, she stumbled upon something she hadn't seen in years, a stack of letters tied together with a faded ribbon. They weren't from John, they were from someone else, Michael Miller, John's older brother. Mary sat down, her hands shaking as she untied the ribbon and began to read. Michael's letters told a story she had almost forgotten. After John had left, it was Michael who had stepped in to help her. He had driven her to doctor's appointments, paid for groceries when her part-time job wasn't enough, and even offered to take care of her rent when she had fallen behind. His words were gentle, filled with concern and quiet admiration. One letter stood out. "Dear Mary, I know it's not my place, but I want you to know that I see how hard you're working. You're stronger than anyone I've ever known, and I wish John could see that too. I'll keep helping however I can, even if it means staying in the background. You deserve someone who won't run away. Yours, Michael." Mary's heart ached as she read his words. She had been so consumed with survival that she had never stopped to acknowledge just how much Michael had done for her. He had been there, quietly supporting her while John had disappeared without a trace. The next morning, Mary made a decision. She called Michael. "Michael, it's Mary," she said hesitantly. "I found your letters. I don't even know where to begin." Michael's voice was warm, familiar. "Mary, you don't need to say anything. I just wanted to help you back then. Well, I think you deserve to know, Mary said. John's back. He wants to meet the kids. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Finally, Michael spoke, his tone measured. Be careful, Mary. John has always been good at saying the right thing, but actions speak louder than words. Later that day, Mary sat her children down again, this time holding one of Michael's letters in her hand. There's something you both need to know, she began, her voice trembling. Your Uncle Michael, he's the one who was there for us after your father left. He's the one who helped me keep things together. David's eyes widened. Uncle Michael. I remember him a little. He used to visit sometimes when I was a kid. Emily looked confused. Why didn't you tell us this before? Mary hesitated. Because I didn't think it mattered anymore. I wanted to move on, to focus on us. But now that your father is back, I think it's important for you to know the truth. David leaned back, his arms crossed. So he left, and Uncle Michael picked up the pieces. And now Dad wants a second chance? What does Uncle Michael think about all this? Mary's heart sank. She hadn't considered the ripple effect John's return would have on Michael, who had sacrificed so much to help them. That evening, John showed up at their home again, this time with flowers in hand. Mary stepped outside to meet him, her expression unreadable. You need to leave, she said firmly. Mary, please, John said. I know I hurt you, but I'm trying to make things right. You don't get to make things right by showing up with flowers, Mary snapped. While you were off living your life, your brother was here helping me raise our kids. You don't even deserve to stand on this porch. John's face fell, and for a moment Mary thought he might walk away. But instead, he said something that stopped her in her tracks. You think I don't know that? Michael told me what he did for you. I've been carrying that guilt for 20 years, Mary. I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I can't leave without trying. Mary stared at him, her resolve wavering. The truth of what Michael had done and what John hadn't was a weight they would all have to carry. But for now, she wasn't ready to let him back in. I'll think about it, she said finally, her voice cold. But don't come back here uninvited again. As John walked away, Mary felt a mixture of anger, sorrow, and confusion. She had spent so long building a life without him. Letting him back in felt like reopening an old wound, and she wasn't sure she could survive that again. The days following Mary's confrontation with John were filled with unease. Emily, now armed with the knowledge of her Uncle Michael's sacrifices, began asking questions Mary had hoped to avoid. Why didn't Uncle Michael stay in our lives? Emily asked one afternoon as Mary prepared dinner. Mary sighed, setting down the spoon she had been stirring with. He wanted to, Emily, but I asked him to step back. I didn't want you two growing up confused about who your father was. Emily tilted her head, her curiosity piqued. Do you think he would want to see us now? Mary hesitated. She hadn't spoken to Michael about reuniting with the children, but the idea lingered in her mind. Michael had been their quiet protector, their hidden guardian. If anyone deserved to reconnect with her family, it was him. That evening, Mary made another call to Michael. His voice was calm, tinged with concern as he answered. Michael, it's me again, Mary began nervously. I told the kids about you, about everything you did for us. There was a pause before Michael replied. I see. How did they take it? Emily's curious. She wants to meet you, Mary said, her voice soft. David, well, he's angry. At John, at me, maybe even at you. But I think he needs to see you too. Michael's voice grew warm. I'd like to see them, Mary. It's been too long. Michael came to visit the following weekend. Emily was ecstatic, her bright eyes lighting up as she hugged her uncle for the first time in years. David, however, stood stiffly at the edge of the room, his arms crossed. So, you're the one who helped us? David asked bluntly, his tone cold. Michael nodded, his expression kind but firm. I did what I could, David. Your mother deserved support, and so did you and your sister. David narrowed his eyes. And where were you when we needed a real father? David, Mary snapped, but Michael raised a hand, stopping her. It's okay, Mary, Michael said. He turned to David. I wasn't your father, David. I never tried to be. But I was there when your father wasn't. I stepped in because I couldn't stand by and do nothing. David's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. His emotions too tangled to untangle in one conversation. The real shock came later that evening. when Mary was alone with Michael. They were sitting in the living room, sipping tea, when Michael cleared his throat. "Mary, there's something I need to tell you," he began, his voice hesitant. Mary frowned. "What is it?" Michael looked down, his hands trembling slightly. "Before John left, he knew he wasn't ready to be a father. He asked me to look after you." Mary froze, her mind racing. "What do you mean he asked you? Are you saying he planned this?" Michael nodded slowly. "Not entirely. He was scared, Mary. He didn't think he could handle the responsibility. He begged me to step in if he couldn't do it himself." Mary's heart sank as the weight of Michael's words hit her. John's abandonment hadn't been a spur-of-the-moment decision. It had been premeditated. He had left knowing Michael would be there to pick up the pieces. That night, Mary lay awake, staring at the ceiling. She felt betrayed all over again, not just by John, but by the truth she had uncovered. She had always thought his leaving was an act of fear and selfishness, but now she saw it for what it was, a calculated decision to pass his responsibility on to someone else. The next morning, Mary confronted John. She found him at the hotel where he was staying, waiting in the lobby. "You planned this," she said, her voice low and trembling with anger. John looked up, confused. "Planned what?" "You left because you knew Michael would take care of us," Mary snapped. "You didn't just abandon us. You handed us off like we were some kind of burden you couldn't handle." John's face paled. "Mary, I didn't. It wasn't like that." "Save it," Mary interrupted. "You don't get to rewrite history. You made your choice, John. And now I'm making mine." Mary returned home that evening, her resolve stronger than ever. She gathered her children and Michael in the living room, her expression serious. "We're moving forward as a family," she said firmly. "Your father made his decision years ago, and I've made mine now. Michael is part of our lives, and we don't need anyone who can't commit to being here for us." David nodded, his face softening as he looked at Michael. Emily smiled, leaning into her mother's side. For the first time in years, Mary felt a sense of peace. She had finally taken control of her story, and this time there would be no going back. Mary Parker's decision to exclude John from their lives had brought a fragile peace to her family, but it also left unresolved tensions lingering beneath the surface. David, although warming to Michael, remained cold and distant whenever John's name was mentioned. Emily, on the other hand, seemed to carry a secret weight, her curiosity about her father simmering quietly. It was on a rainy Saturday afternoon, during one of Michael's visits, that the fragile peace finally cracked. David had been unusually quiet, sitting at the kitchen table while Michael helped Emily with her writing assignment. Mary was busy folding laundry nearby, the soft hum of the washing machine filling the room. Then David spoke, his tone sharp. "Why did you let him back in, Mom?" he asked, breaking the silence. Mary looked up, confused. "Let who back in?" "Dad," David said, the word filled with bitterness. "You let him come here, you let Emily talk to him. And now you're surprised everything's a mess." Emily snapped her pencil down on the table. "David, that's not fair. Mom didn't let him in. He forced his way in. And what's wrong with me wanting to know my own father?" David stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "What's wrong? What's wrong is that he left us, Emily. He didn't care about us then, and he doesn't care now." "You don't know that," Emily shot back, tears brimming in her eyes. "You don't even want to give him a chance. Because he doesn't deserve one." David yelled, his fists clenching at his sides. "Uncle Michael was the one who was there for us, not him. You're wasting your time chasing some fantasy of a father who doesn't exist." "Enough." Mary's voice cut through the tension like a knife. She stood between her children, her expression fierce. "Both of you, sit down now." David hesitated but obeyed, his face still tight with anger. Emily slumped back into her chair, crossing her arms. Michael looked at Mary, his expression unreadable, but he stayed silent, allowing her to take the lead. "You're both old enough to hear this," Mary began, her voice trembling slightly. "Your father left us, yes, and yes, Uncle Michael stepped in and saved us when I couldn't do it alone. But let me make one thing clear, none of this changes who you are or the lives you've built. You are not defined by his mistakes." She turned to David first. "I know you're angry. You have every right to be, but don't let that anger consume you. It will only hold you back." Then she faced Emily. And you, I understand your curiosity. I do. But you have to be prepared for the reality that he may never be the father you imagine him to be. Emily's lips quivered, but she nodded. David looked down, his expression softening as guilt flickered across his face. Family isn't about blood, Mary continued, her voice firm. It's about the people who show up, who stand by you when times are hard. And we have that in Uncle Michael. Michael finally spoke, his voice calm. David, Emily, your mother is right. I stepped in because I loved her and I love you. But I'll never replace the father you lost. All I can do is be here for you now. The room fell silent, the weight of his words settling over them. Emily wiped a tear from her cheek, while David leaned back in his chair, his tension easing. Later that night, Mary found herself alone in the living room, staring at the photo of her children on the mantel. The fight had shaken her, but it had also brought clarity. She knew that her family's future depended on honesty and unity, no matter how painful the process. Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. Opening it, she found John standing in the rain, his face weary. I'm leaving town tomorrow, he said quietly. But I couldn't leave without saying goodbye. Mary crossed her arms, her expression unreadable. Goodbye, that's it, John sighed. I've caused enough damage, Mary. I don't want to make things harder for you or the kids. But if they ever want to find me, I'll be waiting. For a moment, Mary said nothing. Then she nodded, her voice steady. You made your choice, John, and I made mine. Goodbye. As she closed the door, Mary felt a strange mix of relief and sadness. She had finally closed the chapter on John's return, but the journey of healing for her family was just beginning. And for the first time in years, Mary felt hope not for the past, but for the future she and her children were building together. The rain had stopped by morning, leaving the air in Willow Creek fresh and crisp. Mary Parker stood in her small garden, watching the sun rise over the modest neighborhood she called home. The events of the past few weeks had shaken her, but as the light warmed her face, she felt a quiet resolve settle within her. John had left again, this time of his own accord, and while his departure stirred mixed emotions, Mary knew it was for the best. Her focus was on the family she had built, the life she had carved out of struggle and sacrifice. Later that day, Michael arrived for another visit, carrying a basket of fresh bread from the local bakery. David greeted him with a nod, the tension between them noticeably lighter. Emily, as always, ran to hug him, her affection for her uncle growing stronger with each visit. Michael stayed for lunch, the family gathering around the small kitchen table. As they ate, laughter filled the room, a stark contrast to the tense arguments of days past. For the first time in weeks, Mary felt the weight on her chest begin to lift. After the meal, Michael pulled Mary aside. Can we talk? He asked, his voice gentle. Mary nodded, leading him to the porch where they could speak privately. I've been thinking a lot about everything, Michael began, his hands resting on the porch railing. About what you and the kids have been through, about what I've been to this family. You've been more than we could have ever asked for, Mary said sincerely. Michael smiled faintly. I appreciate that, Mary. But I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me. Mary's heart quickened. What is it? Michael hesitated, then looked her in the eye. Do you think there's a place for me in your lives? Permanently? The question hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Mary's breath caught as she realized what he was asking, not just about being a part of her children's lives, but hers as well. I don't want to overstep, Michael continued quickly, but I've cared about you for a long time, Mary. And I care about David and Emily as if they were my own. I'm not trying to replace anyone, but if there's even a chance. Mary felt tears sting her eyes. Michael had been her rock, her quiet supporter, her friend. But this was something she hadn't allowed herself to consider. I don't know, Michael, she admitted, her voice trembling. After everything that's happened, I don't know if I'm ready for something like that. Michael nodded, his expression understanding. Take your time, Mary. I'm not going anywhere. Over the following weeks, life began to settle into a new rhythm. David, inspired by Michael's steady presence, began to soften, even volunteering to help Emily with her writing projects. Emily, in turn, became more focused, channeling her emotions into her stories. Mary threw herself into her work at the hotel, but she also allowed herself moments of rest, something she hadn't done in years. She began to spend more time with her children and Michael, slowly opening her heart to the possibility of a future she had never dared to dream of. One evening, as the family sat around the living room watching an old movie, David turned to Michael and asked, "Uncle Michael, why did you do it? Why did you help us when Dad didn't?" Michael looked at him thoughtfully. "Because I saw how strong your mother was, and I knew she deserved someone in her corner. And because I loved all of you before I even realized it." David nodded, a faint smile playing on his lips. "Thank you." As the months passed, Mary found herself leaning on Michael more and more. His steady presence became a source of comfort, and she began to see him not just as a supporter, but as a partner. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the stars, Mary reached over and took Michael's hand. "I think I'm ready," she said softly. Michael looked at her, his eyes filled with hope. "Are you sure?" she nodded, a small smile spreading across her face. "Yes, you've been there for us through everything. It's time I let myself believe in something good again." The decision wasn't without its challenges, but as time went on, Mary and Michael built a life together, a life rooted in trust, love, and shared history. Their bond brought a new sense of stability to the family, healing old wounds and forging new connections. For the first time in years, Mary felt truly at peace. She had faced the ghosts of her past, made peace with her present, and embraced a future filled with hope and love. And in the quiet moments, as she sat with her children and Michael in their small home, Mary realized that the life she had built was more than enough. It was everything. We've come to the end of this story. Please subscribe to my channel to support me. Thank you.